Hello friends, please like and subscribe to the channel and enjoy the stories. Chapter 1. The Stranger Beneath the Clock Tower. The town of Seaforth was known for its salt-laden breezes, cobblestone streets, and the towering iron clock tower that marked the town square. On most days, the clock chimed faithfully, its sonorous tolls echoing over the rooftops and out to sea. But today, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, its gilded face glowed eerily, stuck on 5:47 p.m. Clara had never paid much attention to the clock tower. She wasn't one for history or relics of the past. Her world was firmly rooted in the present. Yet there she was, seated on the worn stone bench beneath it, her hands wrapped around a lukewarm coffee cup she'd forgotten to sip. Her mind drifted, tangled in the mess of her day. A botched work presentation, an awkward run-in with an ex, and the increasingly loud whisper of loneliness. As the last sliver of sunlight painted the sky with shades of orange and pink, a shadow appeared in the corner of her vision. She turned slightly, her curiosity piqued. A man stood beneath the clock tower, his head tilted up as if studying its frozen hands. He was tall, with an air of effortless grace, his coat swirling around his legs in the breeze. His hair was dark, tousled in a way that suggested more wind than style. There was something peculiar about him, something otherworldly, as though he didn't quite belong in the frame of her everyday life. "Strange, isn't it?" he said without looking at her. His voice carried an accent she couldn't place, smooth and soft, yet with an edge that demanded attention. "What is?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "The clock." He turned to face her then, his eyes an arresting shade of amber, sharp and intense. "It's been stuck like that all day." Clara shrugged, trying not to look too long at his face. "Probably just needs fixing. It's old." "Old things don't always break," he replied, his lips curving into a faint, enigmatic smile. "Sometimes they just stop for a reason." The cryptic response hung between them, thick as the ocean mist rolling in from the harbor. Clara didn't know what to say. She wasn't in the habit of talking to strangers, let alone ones who looked like they'd stepped out of a dream. "Do you live here?" she asked, fumbling for normalcy. "I'm just passing through," he said. "But I think this place will remember me." The words sent a shiver down her spine, though she couldn't say why. "What do you mean by that?" He didn't answer. Instead, he gestured toward the coffee cup in her hands. "You haven't drunk any of that." Clara blinked, startled. "How could you possibly know that?" He tilted his head, amusement flickering in his eyes. "Lucky guess." She wanted to press him further, but something about his expression stopped her. It was as though he was balancing on the edge of a secret, one he wasn't ready to share. The bells of the clock tower tolled then, breaking the spell. Clara jolted, glancing up at the frozen hands. They still read 5:47, yet the sound was unmistakable, resonating through the square with a haunting clarity. When she looked back, the man was gone. Her heart thudded as she stood, spinning in place. The square was empty save for a scattering of tourists and a stray cat weaving between the benches. "Excuse me, miss?" The voice came from behind her, startling her again. She turned to find an elderly woman clutching a small notebook. "Did you just speak to him?" the woman asked, her eyes wide with something that looked like fear. "To who?" Clara asked, though she already knew. "The man beneath the clock tower," the woman whispered. "Tell me you didn't." Clara stared at her, the unease in her chest blossoming into something darker. "Why?" The woman stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Because they say the ones who see him never stay the same." Chapter 2. A Promise in the Shadows. Clara couldn't shake the woman's words. They buzzed in her head like a swarm of restless bees, each repetition more unsettling than the last. The ones who see him never stay the same. The elderly woman had vanished as quickly as she'd appeared, leaving Clara in the dim square beneath the unyielding face of the clock tower. The night crept in, wrapping the town in its inky embrace, but Clara's feet remained rooted. She stared at the spot where the stranger had stood, replaying their brief exchange in her mind. Why hadn't I asked him more? Why did he disappear like that? Her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking the spell. She fished it out, glancing at the screen. It was a message from Liv, her best friend and eternal voice of reason. "Dinner plans? You promised not to ditch me tonight." Clara groaned softly. She had promised, hadn't she? Her thumb hovered over the reply button, but before she could type, the phone slipped from her grasp. It clattered to the cobblestones, landing face up. She bent to pick it up and froze. A shadow stretched across the ground, long and sharp, cast by something or someone standing directly behind her. She spun around, heart hammering, but the square was empty. Nothing moved except the faint swaying of the clock tower's iron chains in the breeze. "Clara," a voice murmured. Her blood ran cold. She knew that voice. "Who's there?" She called, her own voice trembling. The shadows pooled and shifted, coalescing into a shape that seemed to step out of the air itself. It was him, the man from earlier, his amber eyes gleaming like fire in the darkness. "You left too soon," he said, his tone calm but carrying an undercurrent of urgency. Clara stumbled back, her instincts screaming at her to run. "What do you want from me?" He raised his hands in a placating gesture. "Nothing you haven't already given." "What does that even mean?" she demanded, anger bubbling up to mask her fear. "You're not making any sense." The man sighed, glancing toward the clock tower. "I didn't mean to scare you, but I needed you to stay long enough to hear this." Clara crossed her arms tightly, trying to appear braver than she felt. "Hear what?" He stepped closer, and despite every rational thought telling her to retreat, she stood her ground. His presence was magnetic, pulling her in against her better judgment. "There's a reason the clock stopped today," he said, his voice low, "and a reason you were here when it happened." "I don't believe in fate," she shot back. "Neither do I," he said with a faint smile. "But this isn't fate. It's a choice, one that you have to make before midnight." Her stomach twisted. "A choice about what?" "Whether you'll help me," he said simply. Clara blinked, thrown off by the directness of his answer. "Help you with what?" The man's expression darkened, his gaze flicking to the clock tower once more. "Breaking the cycle." Before she could press him further, the bells rang out again, their chime heavy with a resonance that seemed to vibrate in her bones. The hands still read 5:47, yet the sound reverberated through the square with unnatural force. "You have until midnight," he said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "But know this, once you step through that door, there's no turning back." "What door?" she demanded, her pulse racing. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small, intricate key. He held it out to her, the metal glinting faintly in the moonlight. Clara hesitated, her fingers twitching at her sides. Everything about this screamed danger, yet some unnamable force urged her forward. "Take it," he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "It's yours, after all." Her hand moved of its own accord, closing around the key. It was cold against her skin, its weight both tangible and symbolic. "What now?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The man stepped back, his form beginning to blur at the edges, as though the darkness itself was claiming him. "Follow the bells, they'll show you the way." And just like that, he was gone. The square was silent again, save for the distant crash of waves against the harbor. Clara looked down at the key in her hand, its intricate design seeming to pulse faintly with an inner light. She didn't know what she'd just agreed to, but one thing was certain. Her life, ordinary and predictable as it had been, was no longer her own. The clock tower loomed above, its frozen face unyielding. And somewhere in the distance, the bells began to toll once more. Chapter 3. The Door That Shouldn't Exist. The bells grew louder, each toll reverberating through Clara's chest like a heartbeat too big for her body. She clutched the key tighter, its cold edges biting into her palm, and looked around the square. Everything appeared unchanged. The cobblestones, the empty benches, the streetlights flickering to life one by one. Yet she could feel the shift, a distortion in the air that made her skin prickle. "Follow the bells," the stranger had said. But where? Her eyes landed on the clock tower. Its iron doors were usually sealed shut, their rusted surface a testament to decades of disuse. Tonight, though, they stood ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness that seemed impossibly deep. Clara's heart raced as she took a hesitant step toward the tower. The bells tolled again, louder now, as if urging her forward. She glanced around the square one last time, hoping for a sign, a reason to turn back. But the square was deserted, the elderly woman and her cryptic warning nowhere to be seen. With a deep breath, Clara stepped through the iron doors. Inside, the air was damp and heavy, carrying the faint scent of seawater and iron. The narrow staircase spiraled upward, its stone steps worn smooth by countless footsteps. Clara's own footsteps echoed loudly as she climbed, the sound bouncing off the curved walls. The bells rang again, louder than ever, and she realized they weren't coming from above, they were below. She froze mid-step, her pulse quickening. The logical part of her brain screamed that this was impossible. Bells belonged in belfries, not basements. But logic had no place in whatever she'd stumbled into. The key in her hand pulsed faintly, a rhythmic thrum that matched the tolling of the bells. Clara turned, descending the stairs with growing urgency. At the base of the tower, she found a small door embedded in the stone wall, its surface covered in intricate carvings that seemed to shift and writhe in the flickering light. It hadn't been there when she entered. Her breath hitched as she knelt, holding the key up to the lock. The carvings stilled, the key slipping into place with an almost magnetic pull. She hesitated. No turning back, the stranger had warned. But the bells tolled again, and the door seemed to hum with anticipation. Clara turned the key. The door swung inward silently, revealing a room bathed in soft golden light. It was nothing like she'd expected. The space was vast, far larger than the base of the clock tower should allow. Its walls were lined with shelves, each crammed with objects that defied categorization, glittering vials of liquid that shifted colors as she looked at them, clocks that ticked backward, and books whose titles flickered and changed like living creatures. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it rested a single object, a pocket watch. Clara stepped closer, drawn to it despite the warnings screaming in her mind. The watch was simple, its face etched with the same intricate patterns that adorned the door. But its hands weren't moving. They were frozen, pointing to 5:47. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and picked it up. The moment her skin made contact with the cool metal, the room seemed to shift. The golden light dimmed, replaced by shadows that stretched and danced like living things. "Careful with that," a voice said behind her. Clara whirled around, clutching the watch to her chest. The stranger stood in the doorway, his amber eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "What is this place?" she demanded. "What's happening?" "This," he said, gesturing to the room, "is a sanctuary, a crossroads, a place where time and choice collide." His words only deepened her confusion. "And this?" She held up the watch. "That," he said, his expression darkening, "is the heart of it all, the reason the clock stopped, the reason I need your help." "Why me?" Clara asked, her voice breaking. "I'm nobody. I don't even know you." He stepped closer, his gaze softening. "You don't need to know me, but you're not nobody, Clara. You're the only one who could hear the bells, the only one who could open the door." She stared at him, her grip on the watch tightening. "What happens now?" He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Now you decide. You can leave this place, walk away, and forget it ever existed. Or you can stay, take the watch, and help me fix what's broken." "What's broken?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The cycle," he said, his tone heavy. "The clock tower's bells keep time balanced, but someone is trying to break it. If they succeed, time won't just stop, it will unravel. Every moment, every choice, every life, erased." Clara's mind spun, the weight of his words crashing down on her. "And if I take the watch?" His gaze locked onto hers, steady and unyielding. "If you take it, you'll become part of the cycle. A guardian. It won't be easy, and it won't be safe, but it will matter." The room fell silent, the bell's toll fading into a distant echo. Clara looked down at the watch in her hands, its frozen face gleaming faintly in the dim light. She thought of her ordinary life, the loneliness she carried, the yearning for something more. Was this what she'd been waiting for? Or was she stepping into a trap she didn't fully understand? The stranger's voice broke the silence. "It's your choice, Clara, but choose quickly. Midnight's almost here." Chapter 4. The Choice. That wasn't. Clara stood frozen, the weight of the watch in her hand impossibly heavy. The stranger's amber eyes bore into hers, expectant but not impatient, like a man who'd asked the same question 1,000 times before. The room seemed to hold its breath. The golden light flickered, the shadows stretching longer, darker. Somewhere in the distance, the faint tolling of the bells continued, a steady reminder of the narrowing window. Fix the cycle, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Become a guardian of time? The stranger nodded. That's the simplest way to put it. Clara exhaled sharply, shaking her head. This is insane. This can't be real. I mean, what even is time, really? It's not something you can just fix like a broken clock. It is, he said calmly. And it's not. She threw her hands up, exasperated. That's not an answer. Clara, he said, stepping closer. His voice softened, but the urgency in his tone remained. I know this is overwhelming. I know it doesn't make sense right now, but you're here because you can do this. And because if you don't, no one else will. She laughed bitterly, her eyes darting to the room's bizarre shelves and shimmering objects. Why me? I'm just me. I work at a coffee shop. I forget people's orders half the time. I don't know anything about fixing anything, let alone time. The stranger tilted his head, his expression unreadable. Maybe that's exactly why you're the one who can. She blinked at him, her mind scrambling for logic. Before she could respond, the key in her pocket began to pulse again. Harder this time, its rhythm syncing with the tolling bells. The sound grew louder, the room trembling as if under the weight of something immense. The golden light dimmed further, flickering like a candle on the verge of snuffing out. What's happening? She asked, panic creeping into her voice. Time's almost up, he said grimly. If you don't decide before midnight, the door will close. Permanently. Clara looked at the watch in her hand, its frozen hand still locked on 5:47. Her thoughts raced. Could she really do this? Could she leave behind everything she knew, however mundane, and step into a role she didn't understand? But before she could answer, the room shifted. The air grew colder, and a low, guttural sound echoed through the space like the groan of ancient wood under pressure. The stranger tensed, his gaze snapping toward the door she'd entered through. They're here, he said, his voice tight. Who's here? Clara demanded, gripping the watch tightly. The ones trying to break the cycle, he said, striding toward her. They can't touch you as long as you have that watch, but if they get it... He didn't finish the sentence. The door burst open, and the light from outside poured in, stark and blinding. Silhouetted in the doorway stood 3 figures, their shapes indistinct, but radiating an overwhelming sense of menace. The stranger stepped in front of Clara, his stance protective. Don't let them take it, he said over his shoulder. Whatever happens, hold on to the watch. The figures advanced, their movements unnervingly smooth, as if they were gliding rather than walking. The room seemed to shrink around them, the golden light replaced by an oppressive darkness that swallowed everything in its path. Clara's heart pounded as she stumbled backward, the watch clutched tightly in her hand. What do they want? They want to destroy it, the stranger said, his voice edged with steel, and everything it protects. The figures stopped a few paces away, their forms flickering like static on an old television screen. One of them extended a hand, its fingers unnaturally long and clawed. Give it to us, it said, its voice a rasping, hollow echo. It doesn't belong to you. Clara's grip tightened. Why should I trust you? The figure tilted its head, its hollow voice carrying a chilling calm. Because he's lying to you. She glanced at the stranger, whose jaw was set in a hard line. Don't listen to them, he said. The figure's form flickered again, shifting slightly. Did he tell you what happens to guardians? It asked. Clara's breath hitched. What do you mean? The stranger shot her a sharp look. Don't. But the figure stepped closer, its static-like form becoming almost solid. Did he tell you that once you take the watch, you stop existing outside of the cycle? That your life, your real life, will end? Clara's blood ran cold. She turned to the stranger. Is that true? He didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the figures. It's not that simple. That's not a no, she shouted, her voice rising. The figure extended its hand further. You don't have to do this, it said. Give us the watch, and you can walk away. Go back to your life. Forget any of this ever happened. Clara's mind reeled. The weight of the watch in her hand seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. She looked at the stranger, then at the figures, the air thick with tension. What happens if I give it to them? She asked, her voice trembling. The stranger's head snapped toward her, his eyes blazing. You can't. If they destroy it, the cycle breaks. Everything unravels. You, me, this world, it'll all cease to exist. And if I keep it? She whispered. His expression softened, though the tension in his stance didn't waver. You save it, but you won't be the same. You'll be part of the cycle, bound to protect it forever. The figure's voice cut through the air like a blade. He's asking you to sacrifice your life for his war. Is that what you want, Clara? The bells tolled again, louder and more urgent, as if counting down the final moments. Clara closed her eyes, her chest heaving. The weight of the choice pressed down on her like a tidal wave. And then, in one fluid motion, she made her decision. She opened her eyes, her fingers moving to Chapter 5, The Unbroken Clock. Clara's fingers closed around the watch, its cold surface grounding her as the chaos roared around her. Her mind screamed with uncertainty, her heart a tempest of fear and defiance. Yet, beneath the noise, a single truth crystallized. There was no way out without consequences. The figures advanced, their distorted forms looming closer, the air around them crackling with an unnatural energy. The stranger reached for her, but Clara stepped back, holding the watch out between them. "Stop!" she shouted, her voice trembling, but loud enough to cut through the cacophony. The figures paused, their hollow, static-filled shapes flickering uncertainly. Even the stranger stilled, his amber eyes locked on hers with something between fear and hope. "I'll decide," she said, her voice steadying, "but not on your terms. Not on anyone's terms but mine." The lead figure tilted its head, its claws twitching. "You can't choose freely. The cycle demands sacrifice." The stranger's voice was low, urgent. "Clara, don't listen to them. They'll say anything to get the watch." She ignored him, her gaze darting between them and the watch in her hand. It was warm now, pulsing with a faint energy that seemed to resonate with her heartbeat. She thought about the stranger's words, about the life she might lose, about the life she might save. But then a deeper thought struck her. What if there's another way? Clara took a step toward the figures, holding the watch out in front of her. They twitched, their forms flickering wildly, and for a moment the shadows in the room seemed to ripple with anticipation. "If this watch is so powerful," she said, her voice cutting through the tension, "why does it have to be controlled by anyone? Why does it need guardians or destroyers? Why can't it just exist?" The figures hissed in unison, their claws stretching toward her. "Foolish girl, the cycle cannot sustain itself." The stranger's voice rose in alarm. "Clara, no, you don't understand what you're doing." Her grip on the watch tightened. "No, I think I do. All of you, him, you're all fighting over something that doesn't belong to any of us. Maybe it's not the cycle that's broken. Maybe it's us." She stepped back, raising the watch above her head. Its surface glowed brighter, the intricate patterns on its face swirling as if alive. "No one gets to control this anymore," she said. "Not you, not him, not even me." And with a final defiant cry, Clara hurled the watch to the ground. The moment the watch shattered, the room erupted into chaos. A blinding light burst forth, consuming the shadows and figures in an instant. The air hummed with raw energy, a sound so intense it felt like it might tear the fabric of reality apart. Clara was thrown backward, her vision swimming as the light enveloped everything. When the brilliance subsided, she found herself lying on the cold stone floor. The room was empty, the shelves and their strange objects gone. Even the stranger and the figures had vanished. The only thing that remained was the clock tower's bells, tolling softly in the distance. She sat up slowly, her head spinning. The key was still in her pocket, but the watch was gone. No shards, no remnants, nothing to prove it had ever existed. As she staggered to her feet, the tower's iron doors creaked open behind her. Moonlight spilled in, illuminating the familiar square beyond. Clara stepped outside, the cool night air filling her lungs. The town was eerily quiet, the streets deserted. But something was different. The clock tower's face, which had been frozen at 5:47, now read 12. She stared at it, a strange sense of calm washing over her. For the first time, the hands were moving, ticking forward with a steady, measured rhythm. The bells tolled one final time, their sound clear and pure. Clara smiled faintly, her heart lighter than it had been in years. She didn't know what she'd just done, or what the consequences might be, but for the first time, she felt free. And somewhere in the vastness of time, the cycle continued, unchained, unbroken, and finally its own. Epilogue. The Silent Hour. The streets of the town were still. A gentle wind whispered through the square, carrying with it a sense of something new, something unspoken. Clara stood beneath the clock tower watching its hands move. It was a simple thing, time resuming its natural flow, but to her, it felt monumental. She exhaled deeply, letting the weight of everything she'd experienced roll off her shoulders. The stranger, the figures, the watch. They felt like distant memories already, fading like dreams upon waking. Yet, there was a quiet sense of loss. She had acted on instinct, shattering the watch and rejecting the roles thrust upon her. But in doing so, she had also severed any chance to fully understand what she had been a part of. Maybe that's for the best, she thought, brushing dust from her hands. The sound of footsteps broke the silence. Clara turned, her pulse quickening. It was the stranger. He emerged from the shadows, his amber eyes dimmed but still holding that otherworldly glow. His once imposing figure seemed smaller, warier, as if the burden he carried had lightened, and yet left him hollow. "You survived," he said, his voice softer now, almost human. "So did you," Clara replied, crossing her arms. She couldn't decide whether to feel relieved or wary. He stopped a few paces away, his gaze drifting to the clock tower. "It's fixed," he said simply. She nodded. "I think so, but not because of me. I just—" She hesitated, searching for the right words. "I got out of the way." The corners of his mouth lifted, a faint smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Sometimes that's the bravest thing you can do." Clara frowned. "Why are you still here? The watch is gone. The cycle doesn't need a guardian anymore." "I don't know," he admitted, his tone tinged with sadness. "Maybe I'm bound to it in ways I don't fully understand. Or maybe—" He paused, studying her. "Maybe I stayed to thank you." "For what?" she asked, surprised. "For doing what I couldn't," he said, "for breaking the chain." Clara's chest tightened. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. The stranger took a step back, his form beginning to shimmer like a mirage. "This is where we part ways," he said. "The cycle will go on, but it'll be different now, freer, and so will you." She opened her mouth to speak, but he was already fading, his outline dissolving into the night. "Wait," she called out, her voice catching. "What happens to you?" His reply was barely a whisper. "I'll find my place, just as you found yours." And then he was gone. Clara stood alone in the square, the silence pressing in once more. But this time it felt comforting, like a warm embrace. She glanced at the clock tower one last time before turning toward the narrow streets that led home. As she walked, the world seemed sharper, more vivid. The stars above glittered brighter. The air felt crisper, and her steps were lighter. For the first time in a long while, Clara felt truly alive. She didn't know what the future held, but she wasn't afraid. Whatever came next, she would meet it head-on, no longer bound by the weight of things she couldn't control. And somewhere far beyond her reach, the bells of the clock tower tolled once more, echoing through time, free at last. Thank you for journeying through this tale.